Okay, that worked. I am very pleased to be here. My name is Rich Clowder. I work with John and Barbara to support John's chairmanship of the group. I want to echo one of the themes of the day. I don't think a speaker's been up here without acknowledging how wonderful it is to be in person and to see everybody. And I just saw a couple of my colleagues who I hadn't seen ever in person since the pandemic. So it's really just a wonderful opportunity for all of us to come together and enjoy fellowship. I'd also like to take this opportunity to introduce all of you to Steve Weichel, who is going to introduce the panel and panelists. By way of introduction, Steve has been a trusted, thoughtful, and critical collaborator and resource for our group in the real estate group within DLA Piper. He actually reminds me of my favorite podcaster. The New York Times' Ezra Klein, if any of you know him, in that Steve is comfortable in a wide range of idea spaces, in his case, both within and beyond the real estate industry. He is a disruptor in the best sense of the word. By the way, in his day job, he is a lecturer, researcher, and industry chair of MIT's Real Estate Technology Initiative. In that role, he explores innovative new technologies and business models to reinvent developing, transacting, and managing real estate, and invests in early-stage startups with companies who are in one way or another connected to MIT. Steve sits on numerous advisory boards of several real estate technology companies and speaks and writes extensively about real estate technology for corporate clients around the world. Steve is well-credentialed, as you might imagine, holding a master's in real estate development and another master's in city planning from MIT. His first job in the real estate industry involved restoring historic theaters in Detroit's Fox Center Entertainment District. And Steve is such a resourceful guy that he distinguished himself by having put himself through college as a professional magician. Today his trick, that's what you told me. I might have said I wouldn't tell anybody else, but yeah. Today his trick will be to facilitate what is sure to be a great session around climate change, ESG, and technology trends and approaches. We've got a distinguished panel here. These are themes that we've discussed around the margins all day, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what Steve has in mind. So
Rich,
take it away.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you, Rich. Okay. Thank you, everybody. And also thank you to Jay and John and Barbara on another successful event, and Thanos for keeping us all on track and on schedule. I'm delighted to be here. And again, thank you to DLA for your continued support of the work that we do at the Center for Real Estate at MIT, trying to understand the future of innovation and technology in this global multi-trillion-dollar asset class. We are talking on this session about climate, ESG, and sustainability. A little misleading. I think we'll probably be talking about the E on the ESG, but we can talk about the others as well. And I am thrilled to have a couple of experts with us today. Marna McDermott, who is the Director of Sustainability at Exelon, the nation's largest utility company, serving more than 10 million customers, and also Ben Myers, who's the VP of Sustainability at Boston Properties, one of the largest publicly held developers and owners of Class A office properties in the U.S., and also a member of the Center for Real Estate, longtime supporter of our work. So thank you for that. So we're going to talk about environment and climate and energy. And please, it's the end of the day. Let's relax. And if you have questions, if you want to interrupt, I'm fine with that. My students do it all the time. So please do that. But before we begin, if you haven't had a chance to read the bios, maybe we'll just start. Marna, would you just give us some background on the area of the company that you work in and the kind of work that you do related to this conversation, and then we'll drill down into some of that as well.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks. Lovely to be here in person. I appreciate being included. I do not have a real estate background, so I'll just confess that right up front. I hope you all be kind to me. I don't understand all the acronyms, although in the last panel, I did realize, at least maybe 10 minutes in, that CBD probably stands for Central Business District.
Yep. Good, we'll help you along.
Thank you. So I am Director of Sustainability at Exelon. Exelon is a big utility. So we deliver electricity. We don't generate it. So I like to say we're wires and pipes because that tends to stick with people a little more than the words transmission and delivery. That means, of course, that ESG or sustainability is very, very important to us. I think that the two issues we'll probably touch on most today that really go to our, the heart of our sustainability strategy, which is what I focus on for Exelon, are climate change and then the equitable transition to a clean energy economy. So those are really things that we have thought a lot about. We have a lot of programs focused on trying to advance our stewarding the transition to the clean energy economy, and I think that is probably our focus for the E today.
And big topics, big topics.
Big topics,
So
yes.
we'll try to slice and dice them and get our head wrapped around it. How big is do you have a team that you work with?
I do have a team. It is not big enough.
Yeah.
And I bet if you ask anyone who does
I
what
was
I
gonna
do,
say the
they
same
will
thing.
give you the same answer.
Right.
It is not big enough.
Right. Ben, you would probably say the same thing. So tell us about what you're doing at BXP, your efforts at BXP and your team and what you're focused on.
Sure. So first of all, it's great to be here. It's not unusual for sustainability to be at the end of the agenda. I will say ESG and sustainability have been sprinkled throughout many of the sessions today, and that's a relief. I think 3 years ago, most sustainability teams were out in the parking lot busking for tips. And now we have a stage and a lot more attention from all of our stakeholders. And we'll get into some of that today. I lead sustainability for Boston Properties. For those of you not familiar with us, we are now rebranded to BXP. We are a public equity REIT. We own, manage, develop, and acquire commercial real estate, primarily office with a growing focus on life science and residential mixed-use development. I have been leading the program now for 7 years. I've been with the company for 10. We're focused on climate action, climate resilience, and social good. My team is a team of 3, and I lead this team in most of our environmental initiatives. So energy, emissions, water, waste, green buildings, all of our ESG reporting, which is where we corral HR and legal and marketing and all the other corporate and regional stakeholders in Boston, New York, San Francisco, DC, LA, and Seattle to tell a story about ESG, which is a much larger umbrella than just the E. So I'm happy to unpack some of that today with this group.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. So we've heard, as Rich said, we heard around the edges around ESG. Let's define some terminology. We don't have to stick with it, but I'm always curious to know how you define. Well, let's talk about ESG versus sustainability, and either of you maybe can shed a little light on that, unpack that a bit.
I'll start. So I think, honestly, they really speak at their heart to the same topics.
Mm-hmm.
If what you're doing is trying to build sustainability into your business practices, then from an ESG perspective, you're going to be considered a strong ESG investment. Mm-hmm. I think it's a lens. It's a question of lens because investors tend to speak ESG, and the compliance folks and the folks who've been doing this for 20, 30 years tend to speak sustainability. I don't know if that's consistent with your experience.
Yeah, that is consistent. I think sustainability is first the triple bottom line: people, planet, profit. Sometimes you hear it, social, environmental, and economic outcomes. So looking at every investment decision through those 3 lenses, not just the economic. The ESG construct has really come from the investment community. And so there was a long focus on G. G absolutely came first. And there was an interest in looking holistically at a company's risk profile and whether there were unforeseen environmental risks, like the ability to transition to a low carbon economy, how a company would weather physical risks from climate events, whether there were reputational risks associated with various business activities, and that social responsible investment gave way to ESG. And I think a lot of people are confused, frankly, about why E, S, and G are lumped together as one category.
But it's sort of what we have, and it may be driven by regulation, and it may be driven by the finance side, possibly.
Right. I think we need to come back to sustainability, meaning it's the Brundtland Report definition, meeting our own needs today without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. For me, that's the most clear guiding principle of what we're doing in sustainability.
Yeah, tweet that. That's a great definition. And we also use resiliency in the conversation as well, which maybe is part of sustainability. But I don't know that we really defined it, but at least maybe we unpacked it a little bit. Let's also talk about net zero versus zero carbon versus net something versus zero something, and that might. Because I think I know the difference between zero carbon versus net zero, which refers to energy, but how do you, and it might be different in your industry than it is in our real estate industry.
It very well may be different. So
Yeah.
I think of net zero as sort of the steady state when the emissions of greenhouse gases that one is putting out into the atmosphere are equaled or exceeded by those that one is sinking or offsetting. And I think that definition doesn't actually tell you that much, to be honest. I think it's the context that tends to really matter when you talk about net zero. So I'll just speak a little bit to our net zero goal, because I think that really helps explain what net zero can mean in practice. So you'll see that a lot of the utilities in the United States have started to think about net zero goals. Many of us have them. Exelon's goal is called Path to Clean. Has 3 elements. The first is that we will reduce by 50% our operation-driven emissions by 2030, reach operations net zero by 2050, and then third, support our communities and our customers in reducing their emissions. So the reason I think it is interesting to look at a specific goal when you talk about net zero is you have to ask, what's the scope? What is the goal on? So our quantitative goal is on our operations-driven emissions. And those we plan to get to net zero by 2050. And I'll tell you, and we even have it in the press release about the goal, we only know about 80% of those reductions so far, how we think we're gonna do it, right? So some of the work that we're doing is investing in things like research and development, investing in things like collaborating on supportive policy so that we can sort of move to a world where we have more tools to get there. But then at the end, when you reduce as much as you possibly can, there is still the possibility of needing some offsets. So perhaps, investments in things that capture carbon and take it out of the atmosphere. And then before I cede the floor, I would just like to highlight that third part of the goal, which is less quantitative, is no less important, because really the focus on communities and our customers and facilitating the ability of others to reduce their emissions is going to be where I think a lot of our focus is, and perhaps where the kind of hardest work is.
And to clarify, with deregulation of the markets in the US, distribution is different than generation. So Exelon does distribution. I think if we were having a net zero conversation about generation, that's a much harder conversation, because that's all of that natural carbon. But we're talking about distribution, getting it to the building.
So we are talking about a company that moves energy and doesn't generate.
Yeah, okay, so that's great. So that's interesting that net is a carbon conversation for you, whereas often in real estate, net is an energy conversation or a net electricity conversation, right?
Yeah, it's energy and carbon. I'd say, first of all, if someone's positioning a new development, redevelopment as zero carbon, that is categorically false. Everything we do has carbon associated because we depend on petrochemical fuels for our
You said
economy.
you were going to be a little,
It's just the truth. I mean, so you have to be very careful with the terminology. The terminology matters. Carbon neutrality or net zero is how carbon goals should be framed. And as it was very well described, it is about, over the course of a year, for example, making sure that any carbon associated with energy procurement is addressed with renewable energy, all right? So you're matching every megawatt hour you consume on site with an environmental attribute or a renewable energy certificate for 1 megawatt hour of clean power. There are a variety of ways to do that through on-site development, off-site energy procurement. But for net zero claims, particularly for real estate companies, the number one focus has to be energy and energy efficiency. Our company has a carbon neutral operations target of 2025, so it's very near term. And we have cut our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions intensities 80% from a 2008 base year. And we've done that through first and foremost investing in energy efficiency. A lot of people look at sustainability programs as a cost center, and that's wrong. Through energy efficiency investments, we've reduced our operational energy intensity 27%. That's pre-COVID. Now it's around 42%. So pre-COVID, 27%. And that avoids around $30 million of annually recurring energy-related operating expenses, which is a large amount of savings for our portfolio. So when we talk about carbon neutral operations by 2025, about a third of our carbon reductions come from energy efficiency in our buildings, so consuming less. And that's very important to our investors when we talk to them about our carbon neutral operations claim. It's what frankly sold our board and our senior management team on making the claim, is that so much of it was going to come from operational improvement, not papering a file with carbon offsets.
What's the other 2/3 though? If you're talking, if 1/3 is energy,
Yes.
what's the other 2/3?
So
And this is operational,
yes.
right? This is not embodied.
Try
We'll
not
talk.
to stutter.
We'll talk about embodied later.
So the rest is a large share of the rest, around 62 to 65% of our goal, on the top of the 33-ish% that's energy efficiency, comes from renewable energy procurement. So where we can, we're opting into 100% renewable power. That's regulated in San Francisco for buildings 50,000 square feet or higher. You have to buy the 100% super green power. In other markets, we're having to get more creative. We're bundling RECs with our supply contracts from specific generating assets. So the entirety of our Massachusetts operations are powered by West Texas wind. Now, the West Texas wind, which we know is an ERCOT, that power isn't generated and the electrons don't flow to our buildings, but we own the rights exclusively to any carbon claims associated with a wind farm in West Texas.
So the 3/3, all of the thirds are related to energy. I wanted to understand if the 2/3 was related to some other carbon source. I don't know if it's food generated in the cafeteria or.
No,
you're talking about
that's
energy.
Scope 3. We're talking Scope 1.
Oh, well, that's good. Let's define Scope 1
All
and
right,
Scope 2.
so Scope 1 is energy consumed on site where you have direct operational control.
Okay.
All of this is outlined in a document called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol from the World Resources Institute. Crack it open earlier in the day rather than later. Definitely not after this session. But Scope 1 emissions are directly controlled. Think gas-fired boilers and the natural gas used in gas-fired boilers. That's the most important. And when I look at the SEC proposed climate rule, Scope 1 emissions, I think, are the most defensible in terms of what a company should and can control and should report on. It gets a little squishier when you get into Scope 2. Those are emissions generated off-site that are the result of procurement activities, so energy sources. For us, electricity is fairly easy to address. It's about around 3/4 of our total Scope 1 and 2 emissions. What's harder to address is steam, which is produced with natural gas. It used to be fuel oil, and it's transitioned over to natural gas, and on-site gas combustion, the Scope 1. Right. That's about only 6% of our total emissions, Scopes 1 and 2, because we're an office portfolio predominantly with small, that doesn't use much gas.
So you can get more efficient.
Yes.
Or you can use mechanisms to acquire more favorable energy from offsite.
Yeah, one more or.
Oh, one more or.
Yeah, the other or, which is a huge movement, is electrification. And there's an electrify everything movement that touches on transportation systems, touches on buildings and the generation of thermal energy, heating in buildings, and how we move from central gas-fired systems like boiler plants or steam and district systems like Boston and New York with Vicinity and Con Ed to an all-electric grid is a really challenging problem to solve, and a lot of people are working on it. It really underscores the importance of collaboration between large building owners and utilities, a very different sort of collaboration than we've had historically.
So Marna, you can probably speak to that. I'm interested, so the way I kind of looked at it after our conversation was that you make sure the power gets to the building and there's all of this complexity outside of the four walls, and then Ben, you pick it up from there. This is a generalization. And then you figure it out inside the four walls. Marna, can you talk a little bit about, and we discussed this earlier, grid reliability and storage and localized generation? What's happening in that part of the ecosystem that is changing and is innovative and that we might want to know about because we're going to be the recipient of those results?
So I'll start picking up on this.
That was a big question, sorry.
It's a lot.
Okay.
Okay, so yes, the energy sector is changing. Let's start with that. Two really big trends that are driving a lot of change. One is that the grid is cleaning. So the generators of electricity, our coal is retiring, more renewables are coming online. And so if you look at the carbon intensity of the electricity that flows through our wires, it has decreased and it should continue to decrease.
Okay.
Meanwhile, more things are being electrified, right? So I think electric cars have come up a couple times. That is one of the more visible examples. Also, there are some less sexy examples, like water heaters, also electrifying. I suppose actually for folks here, water heaters might be exciting. You know.
They are.
Heat pumps.
Very exciting.
Love heat pumps.
Everyone loves heat pumps, a good in-ground heat pump, really efficient. But those two trends, I think, really kind of explain how this whole transition's gonna work, right? Because the whole theory behind getting the economy to net zero is that more things use electricity, and then the electricity gets cleaner. And so if you're moving things that were once very carbon intensive, like personal vehicles, to electricity, the economy shifts that way. So what does that mean for the grid, right? There are implications for the grid. One, reliability gets extremely important. Reliability has always been important, but I think you'll see an increased focus on reliability. Exelon invests a lot of money and also just thought into how do you ensure the grid is really reliable, right? And this is, of course, in the face of a changing climate where there's more extreme weather. And I will say jurisdictions, so we are a regulated utility. We work with our jurisdictions for any of our investments because we need to get their approvals for how we proceed. And our jurisdictions are all kind of, at this point, emphasizing reliability. So that's one of the big implications for the grid is it's got to be very reliable, and we are seeing more external threats. So
that's a heck of a burden. So you've got climate threats, you've got the supply, the generation is transitioning, which is probably creates some uncertainty, and then you've got this spike in consumption on the electricity side as we electrify the built environment.
Sure. Right.
So that doesn't put you
in... So
in...
that gets to the two other implications,
Yeah, okay,
though,
doesn't put you in an enviable
because
position.
there are ways to manage these things, right? So it makes the grid more complex, right? So I think the grid of yesterday, you could draw on a line. There was a generator, transmission lines, step down at a substation, distribution lines, comes to your building. That grid, I think, is somewhat obsolete and is increasingly being left behind because more and more what you have is distributed energy resources throughout communities. You have buildings with solar power on the roof. You have storage. You have the ability to do demand response. So it's a much more complex grid. And the third, I think, implication is there are more participants in the grid, right? So I'll just use my own home as an example. I have solar panels on my roof. I have an electric car in the garage. I get sometimes, on a good month, a very small bill from Pepco. I'm an Exelon customer in DC because the solar panels on my roof are creating enough energy to power my home and my car. So there are going to be more people doing that. We're focused on enabling that, working with our jurisdictions to make sure that the grid is ready to handle that, and supporting our communities in doing things like distributed energy resources because that actually adds to resiliency as well. But I think from a real estate perspective, it actually offers a really interesting opportunity. So if you imagine yourself to be a very large commercial real estate, very large commercial building, and you could have generation on site, you could have storage on site, maybe you have some generation off site, and you have fairly sophisticated demand response programs perhaps that you've worked out with your utility, and maybe you have smart meters that can very quickly adjust. Maybe you can give up a degree or two of air conditioning at a peak time. And then you multiply that by, several buildings. And what you have is really a valuable asset, which is a huge amount of electric load that you can control and deploy.
Parking garage full of cars that are acting as, F10s
Yeah,
now.
if you have a
and
fleet.
the Ford model and the Tesla model, where they use the car as the battery storage.
So if
maybe?
you have a fleet that's busy in the morning but quiet
Back
in the
and forth.
afternoon, you can move
Charge and
power back
uncharge, yeah.
on to the grid.
Interesting. Ben, so thank you for creating that, Marna, for creating that kind of vision for this hybrid. It's not linear anymore. It's got all these different pieces. Ben, can you speak to examples where you're actually doing some? I don't know that anybody has all of those pieces in place all the time, but tell us some of what you're working on.
We do. We just have a very large portfolio, and they aren't as scaled as I'd like them
Right.
to be. So
But that's the vision, right?
that's the vision. I mean, absolutely everything we just talked about, we're doing, and that's the path. We're moving from, I think, a paradigm of utility and ratepayer to more partnership, demand-side management, and prosumers of power with distributed energy resources in buildings, on buildings, around buildings. So we're working through a deal right now with a great client, Wellington. We built Boston's first green skyscraper with them back in 2010, Atlantic Wharf, LEED Platinum, Wellington. And Wellington was looking for space. They were in the market, and we had an 106,000 square foot office building, 20 years old, that we brought to them and said, hey, this would be great space. We could improve it, renovate it, reposition, and we could do a green retrofit, a deep green retrofit, or a net zero retrofit. And we gave them a scope of work for those three options. And they wanted the net zero retrofit, which includes on-site energy storage, about 1.1 megawatts of on-site solar, so covering the garage and on the roof, complete renovation of the air handling units with super block heat recovery, so a very high efficiency, 95, 96% heat recovery, decommissioning of the gas, so we're cutting the gas and moving to a VRF system, variable refrigerant flow, with condensing units.
Wait, say that again? Variable.
Variable refrigerant flow, VRF.
Okay.
Which is like a fancy.
We got it? Variable.
It's a big commercial mini split on the roof that serves the morning warm-up heat to these units. And then we're gutting the entire interior of the building, insulating everything to an R30, so walls and roof. And this building's going to sip power. It'll have an EUI, site energy use intensity, of around 30 kBTU per year, which those of you who live in the New England, Boston area, who pay attention to energy efficiency in commercial assets, know that's a respectable EUI,
right.
among the very best. And this solar will produce more energy than the building consumes on an annual basis. It's sized to produce about 30% more. And the battery storage provides some buffer capacity. So,
right.
And the utility has incentivized through what's known as the SMART incentives, the addition of solar and storage as one project. And that, I think, is going to help solve the intermittency. It's going to make the grid more resilient. We need a lot more behind-the-meter customer storage. And what's exciting to me is it's starting to get incentivized through some of these programs. We also do demand response across our entire portfolio, with concentrated in New York, Boston, and DC, where the incentives have been the strongest. We use real-time energy management at all of our assets, over 250 commodity meters, to help manage peak demands. And there's a good incentive for that too. About 30% of our bill is driven by demand charges,
right.
And demand response payments are recognized as revenue. And so everyone likes that.
Marna, how does Exelon feel about this, though? He's going to go off the grid, basically, with the whole portfolio.
Oh,
right?
he's not going to go off the grid.
No, so that was said earlier today. That's not happening.
Yeah.
The full grid defection, maybe at my house soon, I hope, but certainly not.
Yeah,
for
net putting
1.5
energy
million
back into the
square foot
grid
building.
is probably not going to happen in the commercial world. It may happen in
We're putting energy back into the grid in Princeton. So we have 13 on-site solar developments, about 8 megawatts. In Princeton, New Jersey, at Carnegie Center, we developed a very large system, 5.2 megawatts. And that system routinely has net excess generation. Mm-hmm. And the utility, PSE&G, credits us on a monthly basis.
Right. Wholesale or retail in New Jersey?
We get a very good rate. I mean, it's credited at the rate we pay.
Oh, okay.
If you don't use it over the course of the year, it gets wiped out.
Oh,
so there's some risk there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about, there were some comments earlier about we won't be able to retrofit the built environment, it's too expensive, and I'm sure there's some truth to that, but tell me, have you been working on any of the assets in the portfolio that you just decided it's got to be good enough, we're not going to get there for whatever reason, and maybe share why you couldn't get there?
We haven't fully baked the cake, I think, at any of our buildings. The technology's evolving. One thing that happens frequently in commercial real estate is you're overhauling the BMS architecture.
Right.
So with BMS improvements, more devices, more controls, there's opportunities to make buildings more responsive to occupancy, which is particularly important in a post-COVID environment.
But they use more power.
What's that?
They use more power.
Well, the devices, the power use is de minimis.
De minimis, yeah.
What's more important is that we set back smaller sections of the building instead of running an entire stack for a building that's not fully occupied. That's a huge opportunity for savings. There's also, I think, a limit to what you can do in central chiller plants that we have to acknowledge. Our best chiller plant modernization projects produce about a 20% savings in gross energy use in a building. But deep energy retrofits and what policymakers would like to see under frameworks like Local Law 97 and BERDO 2.0 is something on the order of a 40 to 50% reduction, which requires addressing the envelope. And so we talk about building repositioning for a net zero future becoming expensive. It's about envelope improvements. And the only time I think that's going to make sense is in a building that isn't occupied. And that is a very bad condition for us for obvious reasons. Yeah. So that is not something I'm advocating for, emptying a building to do a major gut rehab.
We've done some research at the center on valuing. It was a project called Smart, Connected, and Green, and it was looking at the added value both on leases and sales of buildings that are smart and connected and green, or some combination of each. Have you gotten to the point of being able to do really? I know you're looking at payback and things like that, but are you far enough into it to be able to look at a retrofitted building versus a non-retrofitted building, and you made more money on the retrofitted building?
We've correlated NOI generation with LEED certification, and this correlation is very clear. Like higher levels of LEED certification, higher levels of investment produce greater NOI. Mm-hmm. I think it's still hard to convince finance that it's causal, right? Because the best buildings are performing the best, but they happen to be the best buildings.
Often they're managed better,
right,
or the best.
Right, so it's hard to run the double-blind trial to really test that hypothesis.
So is the efficiency itself one of those amenities that draws people? Is that the question you're trying to get to?
I think absolutely we're seeing more interest from our clients in sustainability, more interest in our clients in being able to monitor their own use and understand where their power is coming from. We buy energy for our clients, a large share of them. Mm-hmm. So we have a responsibility to deliver to them clean power if that's what they want. And the ability to do that, I think, creates a more sticky relationship. But it's not catalyzing new business. It's just a delighter on top of all the other services we provide to our tenants.
Comment on central metering versus individual metering. I know that conversation's been around forever and in LEED. What are you finding about how when you do retrofit, you have the choice of kind of reconfiguring the building?
Yeah, we have a green lease, and we've been a green lease leader for many years. We were about to be recognized as a green lease leader at the platinum level this week in DC, heading there tonight.
Great.
And that green lease requires sub-metering of tenant equipment, and we try to sub-meter all the spaces. So my preference is to have a fully sub-metered triple net relationship with our tenants in our buildings. I think gross doesn't provide the right cost signals and incentives for tenants to conserve. That's my personal opinion. There's some disagreement on that, even among sustainability professionals. But most buildings have a primary meter at the ground level, maybe on the third floor if you built resilient. We're trying to get all of our switchgear vaults, everything on the third floor or higher. Some are now 100 feet in the air for resilience. And so you have a primary meter at the street, and then a bus duct riser and tenant taps off the bus duct riser, usually with check meters. In some markets, though, like New York City, it's more common to have a primary meter from the utility serving tenants. That offers some really interesting advantages on demand response. There's a pilot going on right now in New York City where they're rolling out smart meters, where our tenants using an app called Logical Buildings can opt in and do their own demand response for their spaces. We're introducing that to a few of our tenants. I think that's a really exciting program. We want to empower our tenants to save. We want to engage them on energy, particularly in markets like New York with Local Law 97.
Right. Right. And we'll come back to the regulation because I want to hear from both of you on regulation. But Marna, can you say we have people here that have clients who are embarking on these strategies for decarbonization, for deep energy retrofits? What do they need to know from the outside? Are you completely agnostic to getting to the building, or should they understand some aspects of how the grid is going to unfold that would influence what they do?
I think those are probably conversations you want to have in the planning stage.
Yeah.
I'm sure that Ben would agree, but I think if you really want to take full advantage of whatever the opportunities are at a particular site, because it's so case by case, having those conversations at the planning stage makes sense. And generally, I mean, I can't speak for every utility, obviously, but I know our utilities all have teams who, do that sort of work with customers to help them think through problems, opportunities, and I imagine most large utilities have that.
Ben, changes that you made after working with the experts at the utility that you thought you were going to do it a certain way and then you did it another way?
A lot of EV charging. We have 350 stations now. Utilities have been tremendously helpful with make-ready programs where they bring in all the infrastructure up to the charging station, vault, meters. That's been very helpful. A lot of incentives for new construction have come from utilities who sit down with us early in pre-design and talk through energy conservation measures. We detail the ECMs we want to pursue, and the utilities are very helpful there. They like owners like Boston Properties that are going to deliver these projects if they have a mandate to spend those efficiency incentives on an annual basis. So I think the conversation with utilities now that I'm really interested in is how we work together on large thermal energy, because it is so carbon intensive and there's still a lot of room to save. In towers in New York City, the cooling towers will run year round through the winter, ejecting heat from interior zones of the building tenant systems.
In the winter.
That's all waste. And with the Empire Building Challenge that NYSERDA is running right now in New York, they're looking to tackle and address that, all the wasted heat through the winter months. And we're finding through some preliminary modeling that if we're able to capture that heat with heat pumps and heat exchangers and transfer it to the perimeter, from the interior to the perimeter, using the condenser water loop that's already in the building, which is essentially a thermal reservoir, we could reduce our steam use in the wintertime about 50%. And we're not alone. Like that is a energy conservation measure that we have not looked at in major markets like New York. Same is true in Boston. And so we keep stumbling onto these things that are, I think, going to take off, but it's going to require some support from utilities to make these improvements pencil.
Yeah, I just want to pivot a little bit because we've been talking about energy, but that's only one part of the carbon story. So have you also, with BXP, been looking at low carbon concrete, wood CLT construction, all of the other parts of the conversation around carbon?
We have. We're relatively early on our journey. What we did 2 years ago is started requiring embodied carbon assessment on all new development. So all projects are expected to use the LEED version 4.1 life cycle assessment credit to model embodied carbon using environmental product declaration forms. So remember early days of LEED where we had no idea what was in our Herman Miller chairs and offices?
Yeah.
How much recycled content, how many VOCs, and you had to pick up the phone and call the material suppliers. Same thing's happening with embodied carbon. So in the construction submittals, the expectation is we'll now have EPDs, and our designers or another consultant hired on the project can do this embodied carbon analysis. The real question remains, aside from reusing existing buildings, which was brought up earlier today, which is spot on, that is the best way to avoid embodied carbon. Embodied carbon is about 10x annual carbon operations, just to give you a sense. So the delivery of a construction project, just the carbon associated with materials is equivalent to running that same building for 10 years. So it is a really meaningful chunk of carbon that's been the elephant in the room. We don't know what the levers are exactly. We know We can pull the lever of repositioning existing buildings and quantifying embodied carbon avoidance. That's easy, right? We calculated a 90% embodied carbon avoidance on that deal that we did with Wellington I was talking about earlier. Where are the low carbon concrete alternatives? Can we source concrete that meets our 28-day strength test requirements that has lower Portland cement? Because Portland cement's the issue. It's about, I've seen wild estimates, 3 to 6% of global emissions. Steel is about the same, 6 to 8% of global emissions. There's some exciting work being done on electrochemical processes for creating concrete. I'm watching a couple companies in that space, and we're talking with some of them. There's another company local to us, Boston Metal, that's using I'm going to botch this term, metal oxide electrolysis. I have no idea what that means, just full disclosure. But they're going to use large inputs of renewables, probably from wind, right now is what it's looking like, as the energy input to create green steel. And that green steel market could be enormous. There's going to be so much demand for green steel.
Concrete sustainability hub at MIT.
Let's do it.
Who knew? There's a concrete sustainability hub doing really cool stuff with concrete. You know, who knew concrete was so interesting? But smog-eating concrete, power-generating concrete, self-healing concrete, all of this.
There's
very
probably
cool
some
stuff.
concrete experts in the room, but
Probably.
fly ash was the original sustainability measure. So you're taking fly ash, which was a byproduct of coke plants, and putting it into concrete. Now there's not as much of that feedstock because we're decommissioning coal plants.
Right, right. But injecting it with the CO2 and other things like that.
Yeah,
So concrete is good. Maybe CLT, kind of unclear whether CLT is that much better for the environment than.
Oh no, it's very clear. I think cross-laminated timber. Oh yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's very clear. It's much better for the environment. The issue has been permitting. Chicago's had some updates to their building code that now look more favorably on cross-laminated timber, mass timber, and I think this market is really going to take off. But the question is, can you build the scale that we want to build? Can you build the 30, 40-story tower and still get the large dance floor with the 60-foot clear spans with mass timber? Probably not.
Heinz is building some, Gensler's designing some, so I think we're getting there on that. You mentioned regulations, so can we just talk a little bit about regulations which impact all of us? Maybe start at your level, Marna, at the kind of the federal level on how that might impact us in real estate.
Well, let's see. So I think probably we can't leave without talking about the SEC's proposal.
Yeah, I think so.
So I'm sure folks have heard about that, but just in case you've escaped it, the SEC proposed a rule for all publicly traded companies to disclose basically more information about climate risk. And so I think it's probably going to hit different companies differently. I'll tell you, when I look at it, I actually feel like for energy companies, disclosing our emissions is probably not as challenging as it is for some other companies, because the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are something that we've been kind of grappling with for a while. There's some harder pieces in there. For example, how do you figure out climate risk? Can you quantify climate risk? Perhaps you can. The proposal, despite being something like 500 pages, doesn't give very specific guidance exactly how to do that. And so I do think it's going to be a challenge if it's finalized that way. The other thing that I think that's really interesting in there is a look at scenario analyses. Like, do you, company, look at future climate scenarios in your strategy development and planning? And so that to me is a really interesting question for the SEC to be asking, and a really interesting question to think about how to answer, particularly from the perspective, I would think, both of anybody who's building anything and anyone involved in energy, because I would think the climate is something you always consider in all your strategy planning. So figuring out how to answer that question seems like quite a challenge.
There have been some, as you know, I'm deep into the real estate technology space and the other technologies around real estate. There have been startups that have stepped in to help us. It's interesting, the SEC is going to make these requirements, and yet the tools don't exist yet or are very rudimentary at this point.
Well, and they've been pretty open about that. They've said, yeah, we know some of this stuff, it's still in motion.
It has to be invented.
Yeah.
So there are some resources, 427, which was acquired by Moody's, One Concern, Climate Alpha, Jupiter. Have either of you used any of those yet?
Yeah, we have a partnership with Moody's ESG Solutions and use the 427 data set. We've been using it for two and a half years. We run climate risk assessment, physical risk, and transition risk analysis for our portfolio. And we've been making disclosures in our 10K in the MD&A section for a while, and now are fully TCFD aligned. So we've been tracking the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures since 2017, and have been every year stepping up efforts to align with that framework, in part because investors wanted to see that alignment, in part because our board and senior management were curious. What are the risks and opportunities of this transition to a low carbon economy? What are our exposures to physical climate risk? And we've had a couple board meetings where we go through risk analysis, and now every investment or major acquisition has to have a page on physical climate risk for the board.
Make the distinction for the audience, the difference between hazard risk versus transition risk.
Sure, transition risk is about policy, carbon pricing, and how that may impact a company's financial performance. Physical climate risk is about losses, catastrophic flooding, fire, extreme heat, water scarcity, and how those physical risks, sea level rise, may impact your portfolio. And that's really challenging. First you have to pick a scenario, right? And so are we on a 1.5 degree path like the Paris Agreement would like us to be on? Are we going to decarbonize by 2050? Probably not. In fact, the odds are pretty good we exceed that 1.5 degree mark C in the next 5 years. If I had to bet on it, definitely in the next 10. And so what path are we on?
Aren't you a ray of sunshine?
I know. But are we on the RCP 4.5, or 8.5 rather, which is 7 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit of warming, and that by the 2100, end of century? Nobody really knows. So you have to pick scenarios that are moderate, maybe business as usual, and best case, and look at them and decide how am I serving my investors as a fiduciary? What is the best model or most rational model that we should be following? So we've decided to look at a 2040 time horizon using an RCP 8.5 business as usual. And that's how Moody's ESG Solutions aligns. And we think that's conservative. And we're looking out to 2040, which is well within our hold period as a long-term owner. And we're looking at business as usual scenario.
So this is why we put this conversation right before cocktails. But I do.
One thing just to note is that every jurisdiction may be different, right? So if you're operating in, like we operate in both Pennsylvania and Maryland, so should you assume that the glide path is different based on the different goals and regulations in that jurisdiction?
And I want to come back and talk about local because that is relevant.
About for physical risk.
I'm talking about for grid cleanliness.
Oh, right. For transition risk.
Yeah.
Transition risk.
Totally. That absolutely matters. The rate at which the grid gets cleaner, which is defined by renewable portfolio standards or clean energy standards, governed by the states, absolutely matters. It's all over the map. DC is 100% green by 2032. California is 100% green by 2045. And there's states that have no plans.
No plan at all, right.
Well, I want to come back to the local discussion, but any thoughts on any users of some of these tools to help understand the climate risk? I mentioned a few, Jupiter, 427 with Moody's. Have you been experiencing that with any of your clients or yourself on approaching this challenge? Any thoughts on that? I wanted to make sure we didn't step over any comments of case studies that were out here in the audience. No? Okay, we'll come back. So let's talk about localities. So we've got, we could talk about we're going to talk a little bit about the UK, the EU taxonomy in the UK, but Scope 3, SEC.
We skipped over Scope 3 earlier. I don't think we got to that. Those are indirect emissions.
I did skip over scope 3. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
it's a big area to skip over.
And also there's Massachusetts Chapter 13, there's New York City Local Law 33, 95, 96, 97, 154, San Francisco City Ordinance. So to share,
Maybe the point is there's a lot of
There's-
them.
there's a
and
lot
no
of
two of them are identical.
and no two of them are identical. So help us through this as real estate people who operate in a lot of those different markets. Well, and you do.
Yeah. Could you want to go? I'll take this. All right.
You're going to pass that off to
So in 2020, I think you can look at that as a moment in time where we shifted from a voluntary sustainability market of a few pioneers to a mandatory market of mass adoption. And I think we'll look back at 2020, 2022 sort of pandemic period as that changeover. And what that means is you had a few leaders that were doing some things that were great. They were putting out the report with the polar bears and the hands with the plants coming out of them on the front cover. I hate those marketing brochures. And that kept some people happy. We felt like we were making progress, but it's clear that it's not enough. It's not happening fast enough. It's not scaling. That's what the question I get most of the time is, great, Boston Properties is doing all this, but how do we get more people to pay attention? Well, my theory is it's got to be mandated. You have to raise the floor, and I know nobody likes to hear that, but these building performance standards are a reaction to not enough people trying to do the right thing and trying to meet the bare minimum. And now, do they go too far? Yes. Local Law 97 is written in a manner that I don't think you can comply with in a lot of cases because there is no green power flowing into Zone J of Manhattan, which is a fundamental flaw. You have to provide the ability for these landlords to procure renewable energy to meet their goals. Now set some lofty ambitions for that renewable energy, make it additionality, which is capacity that didn't exist before, so you're not just going out and buying RECs. So you can put some guardrails around how they do it. I don't want to I'm going to go down a rabbit hole on that. But this shift from voluntary adoption of the few to mandatory adoption by the many is absolutely happening, and it's being reflected in policies in all of our markets. I mentioned our markets earlier. They're all progressive, gateway city markets.
DC, New York, Boston, San Francisco.
Yes.
Yeah.
San Francisco, Seattle, LA. And so these markets, you have a very vociferous public that cares deeply about climate change. And you have responsive government that is largely liberal and inclined towards climate policy and regulation. And what is happening is buildings are viewed as being responsible for 38 to 40% of global emissions. The truth is much more nuanced. Buildings and building owners have some control, but it's limited on decarbonization. You need buy-in from all stakeholders. You need investors, you need utilities, right, to green the grid and offer GHG-free steam and other gas sources renewably. You need clients and tenants in the buildings that care about these goals. And when you're just regulating a building owner and thinking that solves the problem, I think it's a rather shallow view of how it gets solved. So we need to create forums like this and elsewhere where we can really get around the table with everybody that needs to contribute to the decarbonization of the building stock to work on this issue seriously. I don't think building performance standards alone are going to get us to the finish line.
Well, I think it goes back to what we were talking about before. If the theory is you can electrify things in your building, then you need the power that's flowing to your building
Exactly.
to be cleaner. And you don't get there without having requirements for the generators of electricity to clean the generation of the electricity, right? And right now we have no federal law that requires or limits greenhouse gas emissions from power plants.
Right.
And that is going to make it a lot harder.
It's going to be a challenge.
It's going to make it harder without that.
Sure. We're kind of running out of time, and it's been a great day. I think everybody's ready to go have a drink. Can you just, in closing, how would people start? You know, this can all be overwhelming, and I get it in technology. Steve, you know, that was all great, and it's overwhelming, and where do I start? So, Ben, you mentioned board buy-in. You had a comment about that on our call. Where should people who are working in the real estate industry, how should they approach this and get started on it without being overwhelmed by it?
I think they should start measuring things.
Okay.
That would be my advice.
That's,
You have to measure it.
you have to measure it.
And it's getting better because there are startups stepping in and some legacy companies were doing a better job of creating the data lake and understanding what's going on.
There are
That's
a
right.
lot of forums for best practices for figuring out how to count all different categories of scope 3 greenhouse gases.
Great.
And when you start measuring things, you start looking at where's the biggest contribution. You start thinking in a solutions-oriented way about how to reduce those emissions.
So awareness, measuring, that's a good start, Ben.
I think when you keep a scoreboard, people play differently. So starting to benchmark buildings and expose high performers, underperformers. You know, I have a lot of soft power in our organization. I'm not the CEO, but I have a tone at the top with Owen Thomas and our president, Doug Lindy, who really believe that this is the way forward for the company and have allowed me to work on this and set some really ambitious goals for the company. We also have a board-level sustainability committee that's very important to my work that meets regularly from the board again this week in DC. And so that board engagement and our corporate steering committee is really important. But back to soft power, because that's where a lot of this comes from in organizations. It's not managing top down or bottom up, it's middle out. And as somebody who's been in that position for years and years, you have to get familiar with hearing no and learning how to not take no for an answer, because you're going to get that a lot. And then I think you have to celebrate those successes. So celebration is the first thing. Figure out what's working and what's working within the system, and shine light on it. And make sure the CEO, your management team recognize who's maybe going the extra mile and giving the discretionary effort required to do something in a more sustainable way. The second is create competition. So whether it's intra-regional or intra-building or competition between you and a peer who's doing really well. I mean, we talked about like following the crowd, following the herd earlier on today. That's absolutely a dynamic at play right now. People don't want to be outperformed by their peers, and ESG and sustainability has become a more competitive landscape. So celebration and competition are number 1 and 2. Where those don't work, you go to shame. And so if you have to use shame, use it sparingly. Save it for last.
Okay.
I try not to shame people.
You try not to shame?
But I will say, I think you have to think of sustainability as everyone's job, right? I always say, I don't do sustainability for Exelon. My job is to make sure everyone else at Exelon does sustainability or has the support they need to figure out how to do this job that they already have and do well more sustainably, and how to help us express what they're doing, right? So that we can report that.
That's great. Actually, we end with a hint of optimism. So thank you for that. Marna, thank you so much. Ben, thank you so much for sharing this with us. Let's thank them for sharing their expertise with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great conversation. Great conversation.
Thank you, Steve.
And I'll turn it back over to Rich. And we'll be around for questions later.